Why would a woman abandon everything she had ever known to follow a bitter old widow into poverty? Why would someone risk her future, her safety, and her chance at happiness for a life of uncertainty? This was the mystery surrounding Ruth. She was not supposed to matter. She was a Moabitite, a foreigner from a nation that had long been an enemy of Israel. She was a widow with no children, no money, and no social standing. By every rule of her time, her story should have ended in silence. Yet her name would one day appear in the family line of King David, and even Jesus Christ. Ruth did not rise through power, beauty, or privilege. She rose through loyalty, courage, and faith. Most people saw only what she lacked, but God saw what she carried within. This is not just a love story, the narrator would later say. This is a story of divine strategy hidden in ordinary lives. Something happened in quiet fields and dark nights that changed the direction of history forever. And it all began during one of the darkest periods Israel had ever known. The story opened in the days when the judges ruled Israel, a time filled with chaos, violence, and moral confusion. Scripture said simply, there was a famine in the land, but the reality was far worse. The earth was dry, the fields were empty, and hunger ruled every household. Bethlehem, whose name meant house of bread, had become a place with no bread at all. The hills that once shimmered with barley now lay cracked under the sun. Animals grew thin. Wells dried up. Parents stared at their children and whispered the same question every night. How much longer can we survive? In that desperate season lived a man named Elimelech. His name meant my God is king, but in those days it felt as if heaven itself had gone silent. He watched his wife Naomi and their 2 sons grow weaker with each passing day. One night, as the wind blew dust across the empty fields, he said quietly, Naomi, we cannot stay here and watch our children starve. She looked at him with fear in her eyes. But this is our land, she whispered. This is where our people belong. Elimelech lowered his voice and replied, then we must trust God beyond this land. Against everything his people believed, Elimelech made the hardest decision of his life. He gathered his family and prepared to leave the promised land for Moab, enemy territory filled with foreign gods and unfamiliar customs. Naomi walked beside him, clutching their sons' hands as they crossed into the unknown. Behind them lay generations of heritage. Ahead lay only survival. We will go for a while, Elimelech said, trying to sound certain. But deep inside, each of them knew that once they stepped into Moab, nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. Life in Moab began better than anyone expected. Food was no longer scarce, and the family slowly regained strength. Naomi watched her sons laugh again, their cheeks no longer hollow from hunger. For a moment, it seemed Elimelech's painful decision had saved them. Perhaps God has not abandoned us after all, Naomi once said quietly as she prepared a simple meal. Elimelech nodded, though worry still lingered behind his eyes. They were safe for now, but they were strangers in a land that was not their own. Then, without warning, tragedy struck. Elimelech fell ill and died. The Bible recorded it in a single sentence, but the impact was crushing. Naomi went to sleep as a wife and woke as a widow in a foreign land. She sat beside his lifeless body and whispered through tears, "You brought us here to live. Why would God take you now?" No answer came. Only silence filled the room where hope had once lived. Naomi was now alone with her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They were still young, suddenly forced to carry responsibilities far beyond their years. At night, Naomi would sit between them and say, "We must stay strong. Your father gave everything to keep us alive." The boys nodded, though fear flickered in their eyes. They had lost a man who had protected them, guided them, and made every difficult decision. Now, the future rested on fragile shoulders. Life did not stop for grief. Days passed, then months. The boys grew into men, and in time, they did what young men often do. They fell in love. They each married Moabitite women. One was named Orpah. The other was Ruth. Naomi watched the ceremonies with mixed emotions. They are kind women, she told herself, but they are not of our people. Still, she smiled and welcomed them into her home, determined not to let bitterness rule her heart. For a while, joy returned. The house once filled with sorrow now echoed with women's voices, laughter, and shared stories. Ruth and Orpah learned Naomi's ways. They listened as she spoke of Bethlehem and the God of Israel. Our God is faithful, Naomi would say. Ruth would sit close and ask gently, "Tell me more about him." Slowly, the two young women became more than daughters-in-law. They became the daughters Naomi had never had. 10 years passed in this quiet rhythm of shared life. 10 years of meals cooked together, tears wiped away, and memories built in a land that had once felt so foreign. Naomi sometimes thought, maybe God brought me here not only to survive, but to love again. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary days, something fragile remained. Loss had taught her that peace could vanish in a moment. Then it happened again. First one son fell sick, then the other. Naomi stood at their bedsides, her hands trembling as she whispered prayers that seemed to fall into empty air. "Lord, not again," she begged. But heaven was silent. One by one, both Mahlon and Chilion died. In a single season, Naomi lost her husband and both sons. The house that had once been filled with life was now wrapped in grief. 3 widows now remained, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. They sat together in the quiet of the evening, unable to speak. No men would return from the fields. No voices would call from the doorway. Naomi stared at the floor and whispered, "I have nothing left." Ruth reached for her hand. Orpah wiped her tears in silence. Each woman was grieving, but each also feared what came next. Naomi's thoughts were heavy with questions. What future do I have? Who will care for me in my old age? She looked at the 2 young women beside her and felt a sharp ache of guilt. They still have their whole lives ahead of them, she thought, but I have nothing left to offer them. The weight of that realization pressed on her heart like stone. Days turned into weeks as they struggled to survive. Food was limited. Hope was thinner still. Then one morning, news reached Moab that changed everything. Naomi heard that the famine in Israel had ended and that God had once again provided food for his people. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Home." The word carried pain, memory, and longing all at once. For the first time since her sons had died, she felt a clear direction. Naomi turned to Ruth and Orpah and said, "I am going back to Bethlehem." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. "There is nothing left for me here." The 2 women looked at one another, surprised and afraid. "We will go with you," Ruth said immediately. Orpah nodded, but Naomi shook her head slowly. "No, you must not come with me. I have no future to give you." They packed what little they owned and began the long road toward Judah. Dust rose beneath their feet as the sun burned overhead. With every step, Naomi's heart grew heavier. "I am leading them into poverty," she thought. Finally, she stopped in the middle of the road and turned to them. Tears streamed down her face. "Go back," she pleaded. "Go to your mother's homes. May the Lord be kind to you, as you have been kind to me." Ruth and Orpah clung to her, weeping. "We will go with you," they said again. But Naomi pressed harder, her voice breaking. "Why would you follow me? I have no sons to give you. Even if I had a husband tonight and children tomorrow, would you wait for them? No, my daughters. My life is more bitter than yours. The hand of the Lord has turned against me." The words were painful, but she spoke them out of love. The 3 women stood at the crossroads of their lives. One path led back to safety, familiarity, and a chance at a new beginning. The other led into uncertainty, poverty, and the unknown. They wept together, holding one another as if refusing to let go of the last 10 years of shared life. Finally, Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye. Through tears, she whispered, "I will never forget you." Then she turned back toward Moab, choosing the future she could understand. Ruth did not move. As Orpah disappeared down the dusty road, Ruth held Naomi's arm more tightly. Naomi looked at her in disbelief. "Your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods," she said. "Go back with her." But Ruth lifted her face, eyes steady with a courage that surprised even herself. She was standing on the edge of a decision that would redefine her life and the history of generations to come. Ruth took a slow breath and spoke words that would echo through history. Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from you, she said. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Naomi stared at her, stunned. Ruth continued, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. This was not emotion. This was a vow. Naomi searched Ruth's face, hoping to find hesitation, but saw only resolve. At last she whispered, There is no future for you with me. Ruth answered simply, Then let me share yours. Naomi could argue no more. The two women turned together toward Bethlehem, walking side by side into a future neither of them could yet imagine. When they reached Bethlehem, the town buzzed with whispers. The women of the city looked at Naomi in disbelief. Can this be Naomi? They asked. Naomi stopped and replied with a bitter smile. Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Ruth stood quietly beside her, an outsider in a land that was not yet her own. They arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest. Naomi had no money, no land, and no sons. Ruth looked at their empty house and said gently, Let me go to the fields and gather the leftover grain. Naomi nodded without emotion. Go, my daughter. Ruth knew what she was risking. Gleaning was hard labor, and she was a foreigner in a land that did not welcome strangers. That morning, Ruth walked into the fields, not knowing where to go. She chose one at random and began to gather fallen stalks behind the harvesters. The sun climbed higher as she worked without complaint. What she did not know was that the field belonged to a wealthy and respected man named Boaz, a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz arrived and noticed Ruth among the workers. Who is that young woman? He asked. When he heard of her loyalty to Naomi, his heart was moved. He walked to Ruth and said kindly, Do not go to another field. Stay here. I have told the men not to harm you. Drink from our water when you are thirsty. Ruth bowed low. Why have I found such favor? She asked. I am only a foreigner. Boaz answered, I know what you have done for your mother-in-law. May the Lord reward you, under whose wings you have come for refuge. At mealtime he invited her to eat with the workers, and even ordered them to leave extra grain for her to gather. That evening, Ruth returned home with more food than Naomi had seen in years. Naomi stared at the grain in amazement. Where did you work today? Ruth smiled. In the field of a man named Boaz. Naomi gasped, That man is our kinsman redeemer. For the first time since returning to Bethlehem, hope flickered in her eyes. God has not forgotten us, she whispered. Ruth continued working in Boaz's fields through the harvest. She labored faithfully, earning respect from everyone who saw her. When the harvest ended, Naomi spoke carefully. My daughter, I must find rest for you. Tonight, Boaz will be at the threshing floor. She gave Ruth bold instructions that would place her future in God's hands. Ruth obeyed. That night, she approached Boaz in silence and said humbly, Spread your garment over me, for you are my guardian redeemer. Boaz was not angry. All know you are a woman of noble character, he said. I will do what you ask. Then he revealed one problem. Another man had the first right to redeem her. Boaz promised to settle the matter honorably. Before dawn, he sent Ruth home with barley as a sign of his commitment. Naomi understood the message. Wait, my daughter, she said. The man will not rest until this is resolved. That morning, Boaz went to the city gate and called the elders. He presented the matter to the closer relative, who agreed to redeem Naomi's land. But when Boaz added that the man must also marry Ruth to preserve the family line, the relative withdrew. I cannot endanger my own inheritance, he said. By removing his sandal, the man legally transferred his right to Boaz. Boaz turned to the elders and declared, Today you are witnesses that I have redeemed this land and taken Ruth as my wife. The people blessed them. May this woman be like Rachel and Leah, they said, and may your family be honored in Israel. Boaz married Ruth. God blessed their union, and Ruth conceived a son. The women of Bethlehem rejoiced with Naomi. The Lord has given you a redeemer, they said. Naomi held the child in her arms, her bitterness replaced with joy. They named the child Obed. He would become the father of Jesse and the grandfather of King David. Ruth, once a foreign widow, had become part of Israel's royal lineage. The townspeople looked at Ruth with new respect. She was no longer the Moabitite. She was a woman of faith, loyalty, and courage. Through simple obedience and unwavering love, she had rewritten her destiny. Naomi, once broken by loss, now laughed again as she watched her grandson grow. "I thought God had emptied my life," she said softly, but he was only preparing to fill it again. Ruth often reflected on the road she had chosen. She had given up everything familiar, yet gained more than she ever imagined. What began as a step of faith became a story of redemption. Her life proved that no act of loyalty is wasted, no sacrifice unseen. God works through ordinary people who dare to trust Him in the dark. And so the woman who was never supposed to matter became a cornerstone of history. Ruth's story whispered across generations. When faith chooses love over fear, God writes destinies far greater than anyone could ever plan. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the Golden Bible Story page on YouTube. Follow on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. God bless you.